This is a small island in San Francisco Bay. Its name would hardly be known, even to people living nearby, if not for the most famous prison in the world, Alcatraz. According to the official story, in the entire history, no one has ever managed to escape from here. But that's only the official story. In truth, things weren't that simple. In mid-2022, U.S. authorities released sketches of 3 elderly men. Supposedly, this is what the men who escaped from the impregnable Alcatraz more than half a century ago would look like today. Back then, 3 inmates came up with a brilliant plan. They slipped out of their cells, out of the prison building, and finally, off the island itself. Since then, no one has seen them, or almost no one. For 60 years, clues and witnesses have kept popping up, claiming the fugitives were spotted either somewhere in the United States or in South America. All this time, American authorities have been searching, yet no trace of them has ever been found, neither alive nor dead. This is an incredibly gripping story. I'm going to tell you in detail how 3 inmates managed to break out of one of the most heavily guarded prisons using spoons, raincoats, and an accordion. And most importantly, where the fugitives disappeared to. I'm guessing most of you have seen The Shawshank Redemption, the legendary movie about a prison break. But here's the thing. That story is fiction. Stephen King wrote a story. Later, a script was based on it. The characters are made up, and any similarities with real people are coincidental. Now, imagine something like that happening for real. Only this time, not 1 man escaped, but 3. And not just from any prison, but from Alcatraz, one of the most escape-proof prisons in history. The mystery of this breakout has remained unsolved for more than half a century. Let's start with the morning of June 12, 1962. The day was supposed to start routinely. 7 a.m., the guards walked the tiers. By that moment, every inmate had to be awake and standing at the bars, waiting for the officer to check them. But that morning, in one of the cells, the prisoner was still lying in bed, wrapped tightly in a blanket. A passing guard poked the inmate's head through the bars with his baton. No reaction. "I think he's dead," the officer told his colleague, and pushed the head harder. At that moment, the head dropped off to the floor of the cell. The guards quickly realized it was a dummy. Under the blanket, instead of a body, were rolled up sheets and clothing. A similar scene was discovered in 2 other cells. What happened next went by the book. The alarm, the sirens, and the start of a search operation that would grow into one of the most extraordinary manhunts in America. 3 inmates had pulled off a successful escape from Alcatraz, a prison from which escape was supposedly impossible. But the story had really begun about a year earlier, in 1961. Alan West was an experienced thief and carjacker. He ended up in Alcatraz for a different reason, though. He kept escaping from other prisons, which earned him a transfer to The Rock, the legendary correctional institution. For several years in Alcatraz, West behaved well and earned the right to paint the ceiling in the building where his cell was. Work up there was considered a reward, not a punishment. During one of his shifts, he noticed a ventilation opening in the ceiling. It led straight to the roof. That's when the plan for an escape took shape in Alan's head. An ambitious idea needed a team. The ideal candidate was an inmate named Frank Morris. By that point, he'd already attempted 11 prison breaks, and he was only 30. He was first arrested at 14. Then came armed robberies, auto thefts, larcenies, and break-ins. And after each of those came prisons, from which Frank escaped again and again, thanks in large part to a high intellect. His file listed an IQ of 133, a level only about 2% of people on the planet have. Alcatraz became the logical culmination of his record. Prison authorities were sure there was no way he'd escape from here. The other 2 members of the breakout crew were brothers John Anglin and Clarence Anglin. They weren't brilliant, but they too were sent to Alcatraz after escaping from other prisons. The team was assembled, but the members' cells were in different parts of the building. If they were going to coordinate effectively, they needed to be close. A few months of good behavior and diligent work did the trick. The would-be escapees were moved into neighboring cells. There's an important point to explain. The cells in Alcatraz were solitary, small and cramped. This was considered a plus. You could sleep without being afraid for your life. And so, Allen West, Frank Morris, and the Anglin brothers ended up side by side. This happened in September 1961. That's when they started preparing the escape. Stage 1, the plan. Or rather, Stage 0, the background. In 1775, a Spanish traveler first explored San Francisco Bay and noticed a small island in the middle. He named it La Isla de los Alcatrazes, the Island of the Pelicans. In the mid-19th century, during the gold rush, U.S. authorities built a fort and a lighthouse on the rocky island. 10 years later, when the Civil War broke out, Alcatraz became a place to hold prisoners of war. But the island only gained real fame in 1934. By then, the buildings had been rebuilt and turned into a federal prison. Alcatraz's primary purpose was to hold the most dangerous offenders, convicted murderers and inmates who had repeatedly escaped or violated rules at other facilities. If you don't follow the laws of society, you go to prison. If you don't follow the laws of prison, you go to Alcatraz. In the 1930s, the main guests of the prison were gangsters. The most famous inmate of that era was Al Capone. That was when the strictest rules on the rock were in force. For example, an almost complete ban on inmates speaking to one another. In other prisons, Capone could haggle relatively comfortable conditions for himself. But in Alcatraz, he, like everyone else, got a tiny single cell and harsh discipline. Violations were punished up to and including a total ban on leaving your cell. Some inmates alleged beatings, but the prison authorities, of course, denied it. By the 1960s, gangsters were no longer society's main headache. And conditions in Alcatraz eased somewhat. Security measures, however, remained as they were and were even modernized. The prison stood on an island, and the nearest stretch of mainland was about a mile of frigid San Francisco Bay. Trying to swim it almost certainly meant hypothermia and death. And even if you avoided that, the bay had its fair share of sharks. Crossing by boat was possible in theory, but where would you get one? All vessels except service craft were forbidden to come within 200 meters of Alcatraz. Fences with barbed wire ran around the island, and guard towers with snipers loomed above. But all of that seemed secondary, because breaking out of the main cell house where inmates were held was practically impossible. The inmate population on the island was always small, roughly a couple of hundred. There was one guard for every 3 inmates, the best ratio of any American prison. Cells were arranged on 3 tiers, facing each other, so guards could see prisoners from both sides. In the center were gun galleries with armed officers who could potentially fire across the entire interior. The main building had metal detectors and gas canisters in case of a riot. The main proof of Alcatraz's impregnability was the 14 escaped attempts. All of them failed. Or rather, all but the one we're talking about here. That's when Allen West, Frank Morris, and the Anglin brothers began preparing for a breakout in September 1961. They faced 4 problems: how to get out of the cell, how to leave the cell house, how to get down to the water unnoticed, and how to reach the mainland. Sawing through the heavy bars made no sense. Armed guards would be waiting right behind them. The other option was to knock a tunnel through the wall. Under the sinks in the cells were ventilation grills that opened into a narrow service corridor full of pipes and utilities. The bad news was that the passage was too narrow for a person. The good news was that the cement around the opening wasn't very strong. They stole spoons from the canteen, sharpened the tips, and methodically scraped at the cement around the vent opening. They took turns. 2 watched for the guards in the hall, while the other 2 scraped away in their cells. The hero of the Shawshank Redemption spent decades making a hole. The Alcatraz inmates got luckier. It took them only 6 months. In that time, they gained access to the service corridor behind the cells. Clarence Anglin was the first to squeeze in there. Through the pipe corridor, he made his way up to the very top of the building toward a ventilation opening. Freedom seemed very close, but it turned out the opening wasn't just covered by a grill, it was bolted down tight with massive bolts. The plan was to cut them, but that was easier said than done. First, guards would quickly notice if inmates were missing from their cells. Second, working on the bolts would be noisy. Frank Morris's file included the phrase escape artist. And in the case of the Alcatraz breakout, the co-conspirators really can be called artists. What they did, a genuine masterpiece. To keep guards from noticing that the men were gone from their cells while others worked on the bolts, the inmates made fake heads. They used anything they could get: scraps of fabric, paper, soap, wire, cement, and glue. For realism, they liked two things: paint and hair. In Alcatraz, inmates had not only duties but also rights, including the right to hobbies. The crew asked the administration for paint, supposedly to make portraits of their girlfriends. In reality, the paint was used for the heads. Hair was obtained by Clarence Anglin, who worked in the prison barbershop. As a result, the inmates would put rolled up sheets and clothing under the blanket, and on the pillow, the fake head. From a distance, it looked very convincingly like a sleeping person. If you didn't come up close and touch it, it was almost impossible to suspect a swap. They also solved another important problem. So the guards wouldn't notice that a chunk of wall under the sink was missing. They built a cardboard substitute and painted it to match the original wall color. That way, they hid the traces of the work they'd done. The next stage was cutting the ventilation bolts. And here, the inmates' work assignments played a crucial role. Bad behavior could get anyone locked in the hole for a long time. Alan West, for example, was painting the ceiling of the building in that very space above the top level of cells. Because of the painting, trash accumulated under the roof and fell down from time to time, right onto the main corridor known as Broadway. For the prison administration, the shiny floor on that Broadway was a point of special pride. When guards started complaining to West, he just shrugged. "What can I do? The job is messy." He immediately proposed a solution: to curtain off the space below the ceiling with a piece of cloth so debris wouldn't fall anymore. That's how the escapees got what they wanted. Now, no one could see their work on the bolts. There was still the problem of noise. It's almost impossible to cut metal silently. And this is where the quirks of life in Alcatraz helped them out. Despite its grim reputation, the prison had one feature: music hours. Almost every day from 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m., inmates could play instruments or listen to the radio. They say Al Capone even played banjo here. For the escape crew, those sounds became a perfect cover. It was to the accompaniment of prison music that they took turns sneaking up to the vent and slowly sawing through the massive bolts. It took 3 months. The men even made fake bolts out of soap, just in case a guard peeked in and noticed the real ones were gone. Step by step, in that small space under the ceiling, hidden behind hanging cloth, the fugitives set up a real little workshop. The final stage of preparation: a boat. After all, to reach the mainland, they had to cross San Francisco Bay. According to one version, the idea came from an article in Popular Mechanics that Frank Morris had read. It described how to make a life vest out of a raincoat. A quick note: the weather in the Bay Area rarely welcomes you with warmth. Rain and cold winds are common. That's why raincoats were a required part of an inmate's wardrobe. And these weren't thin plastic bags. They were dense, durable material. The administration didn't keep a strict inventory of that clothing, and the men started collecting raincoats. They managed to gather several dozen. It's important to note that many inmates knew about the planned escape. The cells faced one another, and spending 6 months scraping at the walls without anyone noticing was impossible. But none of the inmates ratted the future escapees out. In their improvised attic workshop, Morris and the Anglin brothers began making life vests and even an inflatable raft out of raincoats. They made paddles out of wooden slats. 9 months after they started preparing, Alan West, Frank Morris, and the Anglin brothers were fully ready to go. Showtime, June 11, 1962, 10 p.m., lights out in Alcatraz. The next morning at 7 a.m., there would be a scheduled count. The escapees had less than 10 hours to pull it off. But right at the start, one member dropped out. Alan West, the man who came up with the very idea of escaping through the ventilation, never left his cell. To this day, it isn't clear why. He claimed he'd overdone it when cementing his fake wall plug, and at the crucial moment simply couldn't pry it out. Another version says he got cold feet. After all, of the 36 who had previously tried to escape Alcatraz, none had succeeded. Most were caught, 6 were killed, and several drowned. There's also a third theory. West was deliberately left behind by his partners. Which of these is true remains unknown to this day. So that left 3 fugitives. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped out of their cells, climbed up to the ventilation opening, and pushed the pre-sawn, heavy grill out onto the roof. According to some inmates, that night they heard a loud thud of a heavy object hitting the roof. They say other prisoners then started making noise on purpose to distract the guards. Whether that was an act of solidarity or just a pretty legend, no one knows. But one fact remains: the fugitives reached the roof without being noticed. They had with them folded life vests, the raft, the paddles, and an accordion. The sharpest among you already guessed why. The rest we'll find out in a second. As I've already mentioned, Alcatraz paid a lot of attention to the inmates' food. On the first floor of the prison, there was a separate bakery, and its exhaust flue ran to the very top of the building. The fugitives used that pipe to climb back down. Despite the guard towers and the patrols, they managed to reach the perimeter fence with barbed wire unnoticed. The trio threw clothing over the wire and climbed over the barrier. Then they headed to the northwest part of the island, where the accordion came into play. They used it to pump air into the raft and their life vests. Picking up the paddles, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin started to row. Behind them, they left the most impregnable prison in America. What happened in Alcatraz the next morning after the escape, you already know. Baffled guards, the alarm, a fake head in the bed. The prison administration launched a search. Quickly became clear the fugitives weren't on the island. After that, the FBI, the Coast Guard, and every police department on the nearby mainland joined the manhunt. All of that pointed to one thing: the authorities were seriously considering the possibility that the fugitives had crossed the bay and were on the run. The main pieces of evidence were the fugitives' cells, their improvised workshop above the tiers, and Alan West's testimony, in which he described the preparation for the escape. Investigators gradually pieced together what had happened. But the main question remained unanswered. Where did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers go? Within 3 days of the escape, police found several clues. About a kilometer from Alcatraz, a bundle with photographs and notes belonging to the Anglin brothers was found floating in the water. Near Angel Island, a paddle was discovered that matched the one left in the fugitives' workshop. And 3 days later, a life vest was found on a distant beach, the same type as the one Alan West still had. Police went to the fugitives' relatives, but every one of them said the same thing. They hadn't seen the sons or brothers and hadn't received any messages. The Anglin brothers' mother said that even if she had seen her sons, she still wouldn't tell the police. The fugitives' relatives were put under round-the-clock surveillance, and that went on for almost 20 years. But not a single trace of the trio was ever found. In 1979, the FBI closed the investigation. In almost 2 decades, they'd managed to reconstruct in detail everything the fugitives did up to and including the night of the breakout. But they couldn't answer the number one question: what happened after they pushed off from Alcatraz? Did they cross the bay, or did they drown? No bodies were found, and no one saw them alive either. So in the end, investigators were left only with versions and suppositions. There's still an article about this story on the FBI's website. At the end, it lays out the main arguments for why, in the opinion of law enforcement, the fugitives didn't survive. The key point: swimming across San Francisco Bay is physically impossible. Sharks, currents, and cold water. The version sounded logical. The fourth member of the escape, Alan West, later said the fugitives' goal was Angel Island, which had a half-abandoned military base. There were a few soldiers there, and the chance of being noticed was minimal. From the island, the fugitives planned to make it to the mainland. According to investigators, here's what happened. Because of strong winds, the raft started being carried toward the ocean. Realizing they wouldn't be able to reach Angel Island, the fugitives supposedly threw their things away and tried to swim. But the current and hypothermia did their work, and they drowned. This version was supported by the bundle and the paddle found in the water, but several details undermined it right away. The first myth: sharks. The Alcatraz scare story claimed the bay was teeming with great whites, the very ones from Jaws. But in reality, the local waters are home mostly to species that pose a little threat to humans. Great whites do show up here, but in the last half-century, their appearances can be counted on one hand. The second myth: cold water and strong currents. Yes, the water temperature here stays around 12 to 15 degrees Celsius, 53 to 59 Fahrenheit, which is indeed cold. But for decades, there have been triathlons in these waters. One of the stages being a swim from Alcatraz to the mainland. Every year, hundreds of participants cover the distance. In the last 40 years, not a single one of them has been harmed by sharks. Theoretically, the fugitives could have made it. But there's a catch. In the Alcatraz showers, they deliberately supplied hot water. This wasn't done for the inmates' comfort, but so their bodies wouldn't get used to the cold bay water. There was nowhere to train in the pool. There simply wasn't one. It's one thing for trained athletes in broad daylight. It's another thing entirely for out-of-shape inmates in the middle of the night in icy water. A case that happened half a year later served as confirmation. In late 1962, inmate John Scott got out of the prison, reached the water, and started swimming. He managed to cover 2 kilometers to the San Francisco Bridge, but he was so exhausted he collapsed on the shore and was captured by police. Indirect evidence also argued that the fugitives drowned. In 20 years of surveillance, the FBI never found a single convincing argument that any of the trio was still alive, but no bodies were found either. That's why the case couldn't be closed for good. In 1979, responsibility for the investigation passed to the U.S. Marshals Service. In the decades that followed, lots of new facts and theories emerged. Some claimed the fugitives drowned. Others said they survived and even managed to leave the country. In the early 2000s, the hosts of Mythbusters decided to test the story in practice. They took raincoats, glue, and thread, built a homemade raft, and inflated it with an accordion. Then they tried to repeat the fugitives' route, and they succeeded. True, the strong current carried them toward the ocean, and instead of Angel Island, they landed on the shore near the Golden Gate Bridge. It's possible that's exactly what happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers that June night in 1962. After the investigation passed from the FBI to the Marshals Service, unexpected documents surfaced. Officially, the fugitives' raft was never found. However, those materials said the makeshift boat was in fact discovered on a beach on Angel Island. What's more, footprints of several people led away from it. The same documents mention another curious fact. Right after the escape, police closely monitored reports of car thefts, since the fugitives would need a way to get around. Officially, no thefts were recorded, but those same records mention a missing car that very night. Why did these documents only surface 20 years after the FBI closed the case? And why wasn't the raft entered into evidence? There's no answer. Moreover, many doubt the authenticity of these materials. The found raft story appears only in a single documentary by the History Channel. Other sources merely cite it, and the very fact of this raft being found on Angel Island looks doubtful. The current carries you to the left, toward the mainland, as the Mythbusters experiments later confirmed. In 1962, the story of the escape made headlines across the country. Police received dozens of calls claiming the fugitives had been seen in this or that place. Not a single report was confirmed. Years later, an anonymous letter arrived at the Marshal's Service. The author claimed that his relative had picked up the convicts on the night of the escape near San Francisco and ended up shooting them. He even provided coordinates where the bodies were buried. When the police arrived and started digging, nothing was found. The Anglin brothers' relatives, in turn, claimed they had received letters and gifts from John and Clarence for many years. The handwriting supposedly matched, but there were no dates on the envelopes. There's no way to prove the letters were written after the escape. Possible the family simply made up the story. In the mid-1970s, a photo was taken in Brazil that supposedly shows the Anglin brothers. According to the photographer, they fled to South America and started a farm. Some experts acknowledged the resemblance, but the photo quality didn't allow for certainty. The photographer turned out to be a known fraud, which makes his account even less reliable. As with any mysterious story, conspiracy theories popped up. Less than a year after the escape, Alcatraz was shut down. It was said that its upkeep was too expensive for the government. But rumors spread that the escape had been staged on purpose to justify the closure, and that the fugitives were being hidden even though their fate was long known. But this version has neither documents nor witnesses, only guesswork. Today, more than 60 years later, neither the FBI, nor the federal marshals, nor the public knows what happened that night. There is, however, one argument I personally find significant. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were professional criminals. Each of them had multiple arrests behind him. Every time they got out, they immediately committed a new crime and ended up back in prison. That was their way of life. It's hard to imagine people like that suddenly managing to live quietly for 60 years somewhere on a farm, never once getting caught by the police or the FBI. Most likely, the fugitives did drown in San Francisco Bay, but no bodies were ever found, and no one saw them alive either. By law, the Marshal's Service is required to continue the investigation until the youngest of the fugitives turns 100. That deadline will come in 2030. The story of the Alcatraz escape remains contradictory. For every argument for, there's an equally weighty rebuttal. That's why many people still believe Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers managed to cross the bay and disappear. At the very least, many want to believe it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, and see you soon.